Although my creative works employ a wide variety of instruments, media, styles, and even techniques, they are unified in my approach to begin composing by first determining or designing a compositional technique that leverages the built-in features of the performance situation. A meta-process I call native composition. This approach pursues elegance, novelty, and insight by exploiting what comes naturally in a given performance situation, even if it is normally considered a mistake or glitch, while minimally introducing arbitrary elements. Composed for a building with elevated train tracks on either side and an Airstream trailer on top, Fast Standing Still uses a melody transcribed from the security message heard on the passing trains. If you see something, say something. Electronic percussion sounds are carved from recordings of passing trains, and the meandering celesta accompaniment is driven by video of the surrounding skyline. The light jazz style and the instrumentation, 2 bass instruments, were chosen to reflect the Airstream trailer's visual style and its weight. Native composition does not require digital technology. My Etude No. 3 for horn embraces the natural harmonics of the instrument. Instead of seeing every musical instrument as general-purpose tools, I consider what comes most naturally, most easily for an instrument, and seek to maximally exploit those abilities, even if they would be considered to be mistakes in standard playing, like playing out of tune. Much of my work interrogates our feelings toward liveness and mediation in performance by improvising with an acoustic performer, as I use software that cannot play sound on its own, but only transforms sound that was captured in the moment. These live sampling improvisations allow audiences to hear the digital copy as missing some aura compared to the original event we all just witnessed, which gives authenticity and value to that past now retroactively. And then we witness the transformed samples take on a unique role and influence the performance as it continues. My generative installation, The Collected Solo Piano Works of Ferran Martino as Conjured by Your Presence, uses nearby motion to disrupt the flow of generative music played on a digital player piano. The algorithm is capable of making music on its own, but when it senses motion nearby, it lets that motion shape the music. It does not sonify the motion it sees, but it will respond to it or flex with it as an accompaniment. This short-circuits the listener-music relationship, such that the music cannot be heard without being present, thereby corrupting the music so the pure or original music can never be heard. Another way to supercharge a performance situation and bring the situation to the fore is to feed the output of a system into its own input, whatever type of system it may be. My work, Tappa Tappa Tappa, uses a small speaker cone as a musical instrument by connecting it to a microphone input, turning the speaker into an input transducer, running that through a shifting network of digital delays, and sending the output to the speakers in the venue to be picked up in turn by the input transducer. In performance, I aim and move the input transducer through space, causing different resonant modes of the room to resonate. As the performance continues, invisible points in space become almost tactile as I and the audience become acquainted with the sonic results of moving there. As the acoustic system rings out in response to my movements, and as the digital system constantly warps and shifts the space, it becomes almost as if the space starts to shape my movements in response. I end up wrestling in a quite real, albeit aesthetic way, with invisible but audible forces that live in the room. Feedback is also at work in Sekou De, in which the only sound source is a feedback mixer, or no input mixer. The outputs of a large 1980s Tascam M16 mixing console are fed into its own inputs, causing its channels to sing in their most native voice, absent any sound external to it. More than being an unusual way to make a synthesizer, this configuration causes all of the mixer's controls to take on musical functions that are different from their labels. Treble and bass filters, left-right pan controls, and volume faders instead might affect pitch, the speed of a steady pulse, or timbre in complex ways. It reveals that in their normal operations, these controls do not simply do their work by increasing or decreasing explicit treble or loudness parameters, but instead they twist and shape the electronic oscillation in ways that, in normal circumstances, happen to achieve the results that their labels describe. It puts the performer in a more deeply intimate and visceral relationship to the instrument, and in a wild and exploratory creative mindset in performance. It takes a tool that is supposed to be transparent, only shaping and improving sounds to present them faithfully in their best light, and it lets the thing itself sing its own native song. Whereas many digital artworks are digital for sake of convenience over analog, physical, or manual means, byte-beat coding is intensely immersed in the situation of the digital computer. Its constraints force the programmer to wrestle with the system on its own terms. It's difficult to compose or improvise in a deterministic way in byte-beat. Instead, one finds oneself working so deeply in an exploratory mindset that the result might fairly be called generative music, since it emerges from this wrestling process, even if a source of randomness is not used. My work, The Persistence of Illusion, Hard and Soft Dances, uses a similar phase-locked structure to recreate a 1980s-style drum machine, and makes new music by manipulating the one thing that is supposed to remain constant, the clock, or ramp. Since all sounds and control shapes are derived from that clock, new unintended timbres, textures, and gestures emerge, ones that are simultaneously new, previously unheard, and also more true to the underlying structure than their labels mimicking traditional acoustic percussion instruments. Invited to join a funded collaboration focused on machine learning at my university, my first and ongoing approach to native composition for machine learning systems was to give a voice to its errors and its uncertainty. For this, I needed a crib sheet structure in which a classifier system could report its best conclusions about an input, but an absolute correct answer could also be known at the same time, so I can compare the two in real time and let any differences drive the music. Divining Rod uses a camera and a classifier system to determine what key I am pressing on a typing keyboard. Of course, the computer also directly reports the ASCII code of each key that is pressed. The camera-driven classifier controls the frequency of a sine wave. The ASCII codes of the keys that are actually pressed process that sine wave in ways that result in silence when the classifier concludes correctly, through amplitude modulation and also a band reject filter. However, this process also proliferates any errors. Greater errors result in louder and more complex sounds. This way, only the mistakes of the system are heard. The uncertainty or incorrect confidence of the system will become readily apparent in whether the audible errors wobble erratically or lock in on a constant tone. While each of these approaches is distinct, many of them are similar in their spirit of thwarting expectations, to make artistic results emerge, or by using things in wrong ways. Technology facilitates these kinds of reuse or misappropriation by virtue of the fact that it can only represent anything as numbers that have no awareness of what they mean. Their labels are stored separately. In order to reinterpret, map, or otherwise misread data, one need only change their labels. More broadly, these techniques fit the composer's notion of economy, looking to derive new material from the musical decisions that have already been made rather than bringing in something unrelated. This typically means creating a new melody by inverting, reversing, or otherwise twisting some melody that has already been written in the music, to build some subtle coherence throughout the work. However, in my examples, composerly economy applies just as well to considering the situation of a performance as some of the musical decisions already made, so new material can be derived in some way from those factors. It's also similar in spirit to Douglas Hofstadter's notion of the strange loop to describe the structure of several examples in literature, visual art, music, and philosophy, in which some form of self-defeating self-reference evokes a phenomenon, sensation, or idea that lies outside what should be possible within the confines of a given context. Hofstadter uses the strange loop to muse at the nature of intelligence as something that lies beyond simply being the sum of all the logic inside it. Similarly, native composition as a general approach to making music seeks not to make music by combining notes in new ways, but instead to make new properties of the musical listening experience emerge in our awareness and to explore the potential of these previously underexplored dimensions for creative expression and aesthetic experiences. To extract something from deeper inside the essence of things and their situations, in order to reflect more deeply and fully upon their nature and the nature of music itself.
My name is Abbey Hepner, and I'm an assistant professor of art at Southern Illinois University Edwardsville, where I teach photography. I'm interested in health, biopolitics, and our relationship with place. I'm going to share an artist project with you called the Digital Anatomical Theater. Before I dive in, I'd like to share a brief history of VR because perception is important in my work, as well as the fact that my work is always in conversation with history. The earliest forms of VR made use of the fact that we see stereoscopically. The stereoscopic images feature two of the same image, slightly shifted so that you have left eye and right eye views of the same scene. When we view these through a stereoscope, they appear as a single three-dimensional image. The fact that we see stereoscopically is the basis for all VR viewers, 3D glasses, and lenticular images. Painters and photographers in the 18th and 19th centuries pushed landscapes into this early form of immersive art called the cyclorama. Cycloramas were buildings designed to show panoramic images of landscapes and battle scenes in 360 degrees. The intended effect is to make viewers feel as if they were standing in the midst of the place depicted in the image. The Gettysburg cyclorama depicted the Battle of Gettysburg, and eventually we see cycloramas include more sensory experiences. Sounds, gunfire, smoke. This was such an immersive experience that there were even reports of people on their deathbeds that said, "Oh, that time when I was at war and there was gunfire and smoke, and they hadn't even been to war." These immersive experiences were so powerful and convincing that people believed they had been there. The Sensorama played 3D film and included sound, vibrations, bursts of air, and even aromas, creating a virtual sensory environment. Nintendo's Virtual Boy was quite the failure. People didn't like it because it took the social aspect of gameplay away, and the horrible optics made people nauseous. There are now many modern VR technologies, from standalone devices to Google Cardboard, which allows you to turn your smartphone into a VR viewing device. The Digital Anatomical Theater is a VR experience and is featured as a chapter in a forthcoming book. There's a still image in the book and a QR code that links you to a 360-degree photograph or video in that space. I'm creating my own version of Google Cardboard that folds up into the back of the book so you can pull it out, insert your phone, and view the space in 360 degrees. The photos and videos are shot in anatomical and operating theaters in Europe, former psychiatric hospitals, and in present-day spaces where visualization technologies are used to view the body, such as MRI machines. The work investigates 4,000 years of medical history. It is an exploration of medical knowledge that tracks our understanding of pain, from believing it was rooted in the body to confusion about a psychological origin. But it's also about the power of places to remind us of our history. Early scientific practices for representing the body were conducted in Renaissance anatomical and operating theaters, places where public dissections and operations were performed in order to study the body. These demonstrations were for students studying medicine, but artists were also present, documenting anatomy and the spectacle. In operating theaters, the patient would have been alive and may or may not have been sedated, depending on the time period. In anatomical theaters, the anatomist would be dissecting a deceased human cadaver. The circular architecture of the haunting anatomical and operating theaters were of interest to me as a place-based photographer. In the attic of an early 19th century church in London is the oldest surviving operating theater in Europe. Built in 1822, the operating theater treated poor women. In 1862, it was boarded up, and nearly a century later, Raymond Russell decided to investigate an opening in the attic. Imagine opening up an attic door and discovering this. A single photograph, in my opinion, cannot embody what it is like corporeally to stand in these places that are great works of architecture, traces of history, documents of medical curiosity, and symbols of biopolitical strategies. What is missing from the still photograph is the embodiment of the architectural environment as it surrounds one on all sides. I cannot help but think of the cyclorama, and perhaps VR is our modern-day cyclorama. In the next slide, you'll see a clip of someone navigating the space in the viewer and hotspots that activate sound recordings or text that delves in deeper to the history of the theater. This theater would be crammed with 120 men watching a female being operated on. Everyone would be in their street clothes, and this small space would be incredibly hot. People would be sweating, coughing, and sneezing, and there was no covering of the mouth. The work is captured with a camera that has two lenses, one in the front and one in the back, so it captures the entirety of the space at once. Before operating theaters, there were anatomical theaters where physicians studied cadavers. In the 16th century, public dissection became connected to the criminal justice system, and the courts used it as extra punishment on top of the death penalty. Anatomists preferred the corpses of executed criminals because, unlike found or donated bodies, which were often disease-ridden, the bodies of executed criminals were usually in good shape and most representative of a living body. Female bodies were highly desired because they provided the opportunity to study the reproductive system. Male criminals received capital punishment for murder and female criminals for infanticide or theft. Female criminals were sentenced for smaller crimes than their male counterparts because their bodies were more in demand. Nausea has always been a problem for VR due to the intertwining and separation of vision and embodied motion. Critics of VR argue that immersion provides us a sensation of being in the image and leaving the body behind, serving to separate individuals and making us little more than passive consumers of images. But nausea refuses to let the body disappear. This underestimation of the body, with its role in motion with vision, returns us to our senses through disorientation. During the mid-19th to late 20th century, thousands of women in Italy were housed in mental institutions because of conditions like postpartum depression, alcoholism, and hysteria. I include mental institutions and women's prisons in the book because these are sites that operated and experimented on women long after the days of the anatomical and operating theaters. Both San Servolo and San Clemente are islands off the coast of Venice that at one time held mental institutions. San Clemente is now a luxury hotel. During Benito Mussolini's dictatorship, the population in Italian mental institutions rose by 30%. Mussolini's first wife, Ida Dassler, helped fund his political rise to power. He later had her committed to the San Clemente Insane Asylum to cover up what she knew about his illegal activities. The architectural design mimics other mental institutions at the time, as well as modern-day prisons. The panopticon design, with long hallways that jut out from a central location, evoke the feeling of constantly being monitored, an invisible omnipresence. Photographers like Raymond Despardin had photographed asylums like San Clemente before and after the law of 1978 that closed all mental institutions in Italy. He did this to document what was happening because if he didn't, people wouldn't believe it, and we'd be doomed to repeat history. We may paint over the walls and fill these spaces with gold trim and tapestry, but beneath these walls the stones vibrate from the energy of all those who inhabited this space before us. Let's return again to the fascinating history of the anatomical theater. While much of what took place in mental institutions and prisons was horrible, the Renaissance was a time period of great medical advancement and achievement, and it was a time when pain was rooted in the body and a mystery to be solved, rather than believed to be psychological. Medical advancements today owe a lot to the early practitioners who worked in these spaces. In the very early days of the theater, before dissecting human cadavers was legal, students wanted to study human anatomy, and they would have a human cadaver on one side of the anatomy table, and on the other side was a pig. When the Inquisition would approach, they would flip the table over and reveal the pig, and the human body would drop down and fall into the river that ran beneath the theater. Our modern-day anatomical theater is the MRI machine. The endoscopic gaze, like the reliance on vision over other senses in diagnostics, still negates the visceral nature of the body, and the complexity of medical technologies has increased the withdrawal of common people from decision-making regarding their own body. I'm not the only one to make a comparison between the Renaissance anatomical theater and today's visualization technologies. Marco Montiero has also written about the way that technology's vigilance over the body creates a fusion between machine and body, and the fluidity between the technological and corporeal is used to reduce social tensions, for example, with MRIs or fetal ultrasound images. But at the same time, it creates an interdependence that can only be mitigated with the use of more technology. These technologies also eliminate direct observation in favor of mechanical objectivity, believing that images produced by a machine are superior ontologically and that computers do not interfere subjectively. Many of today's practices still have reference to the Renaissance anatomy lessons such as the 1990s Visible Human Project. Today, the medical industry is one of the largest consumers of VR. A growing number of medical schools are using VR to help students practice operating room skills, engage in realistic patient interactions, and to learn the intricacies of the human body. While I think that we can argue that medicine has made great advancements in ethical patient care, we view achievement largely through the lens of the technological improvements, and the comparison to the Renaissance anatomical and operating theaters provide an interesting perspective. Thank you.
Afternoon or night, wherever you may be. My name is Alexa Ann Bonomo, and I will be presenting my thesis work from the University of California, Davis, titled Codex Endogenous, and talking about how I use metaphor and naturalistic geometry to visualize quantified self-data. Before I came to UC Davis, I received my BFA in Digital Art and Design from Towson University with a concentration on experimental processes and interactive media. I then moved to California and I started working in the tech industry, all while still continuing education and exhibiting installations in and around San Francisco and the East Bay, and then came to Davis to get my MFA in design. Most of my work surrounded the use of sensors, creative coding, and projection mapping to superimpose imagery on analog surfaces like fabricating from the ceiling. Conceptually, I scrutinized what it meant to be sensed in the context of oneself's vulnerability and their data that follows them. I really started to deep dive into topics like cybernetics, empathetic media, and human memory. All of my work was utilizing sensors that output data in real time, thus changing imagery that is projected in tandem with the participation of the audience. So after I exhibited my first work at UC Davis for our first year exhibition, I figured out two things: that I wanted to instigate empathy with data, and that I wanted to use past data to visualize self-memories instead of the ever-fleeting, constantly updating nature of real-time data. So there is simply too much information to keep track of the complex narrative that makes up our own selfhood. When you look in the mirror and you see yourself, you can point out the physical appearance, but it's often a much harder task to recall accurate self-knowledge. It's much like recalling a book or a complex theme of events and sequential things that happened in your life. So right here brings me back to my thesis title. Codex Endogenous can be defined as a collection of pages consisting of phenomena that is spontaneously generated from the individual's internal state. The metaphor that there is a book or a journal of sorts of self-knowledge that will carry out as I reveal more during this presentation. Now I will bring you along with my process, starting with how I went about diligently self-tracking myself for the past year. So I am defining my research methods as a series of experiments on myself in order to develop a framework in visual language on how to attain self-knowledge, process it, and how to understand just how a self relates to the environment. So there are multiple ways to categorize and theorize about the self, but one of the early thinkers in self-theory, William James, came up with the idea of the empirical self. The empirical self is split up into three parts: the material self, everything material that can be seen as belonging to the self. The social self is the self perceived by others, and the spiritual self, which is the self closest to one's core subjective experience, like your thoughts and beliefs. So all of the data channels that I've collected, this is how I've had separated them. Furthermore, it's important to note the modality of tracking myself data by compartmentalizing them into explicit and implicit categories. The explicit data is data that I recall from my memory that is heavily connected to sensory information, what I see and feel from memory, and while implicit data is the data that exists subconsciously, we are able to capture it through technology that can be worn or retrieved from a database. And so to get a deeper sense into my self-tracking methods, I'm going to talk about how I arrived at my current self-tracking method for the past year. So here are some of the considerations and trials that I had considered. My questions that I needed to answer was, when am I tracking and why is it meaningful to my self-knowledge? And what came up a lot was, how invasive or practical uses does it serve? So for this factors into what's considered a burden to a user, which can sway behavior within a space and cause unnatural responses. So burden also comes into play later when I talk about self-reported data. I then settled on Fitbit and APIs for the implicit data channels. Once I figured out how to route my Fitbit data into a web application, and the same for environmental data, I was able to then map them to visual encodings or graphical forms. And now I will present the visual language I am at now. I will talk about each pattern and how each data channel is mapped to a mark on the page. Uh, I went through a lot of explorations with aesthetics and ways of creating imagery, but it's important thing to note is that my process is synonymous with how a well-known information designer, Giorgio Lupi, designs for data humanism. She says, rather than just looking at numbers and visualizing these numbers directly, focus on the reality represented of the data and imagine how to distill these stories into how we represent it. So I was working towards figuring out what kinds of relationships I saw in my data and representing that in the patterns I created. So I'm going to spend most of my time explaining emotion because journaling is an emotional process and helps regulate mood, and all the other patterns affect mood. So to break it down, I took the sample of emotions from a paper describing a questionnaire that is used as a tool for measuring what's called discrete emotions. You can probably identify these if you have seen the Pixar movie Inside Out, but this paper added 8 instead of the commonly known 5. So these emotions are happiness, relaxation, desire, sadness, anxiety, fear, disgust, and anger. And with these discrete emotions contain secondary emotions that describe a mood to a specified level. So in this image, this is the category of happiness and all of the emotions that are subcategories within happiness. And then this is all 57 of the emotions and their symbols. So you can see that each category has a certain shape that it embodies, and then each individual has like a different imagery within that. And this is the rest of the legend. So you have heart rate, which is recorded every day. And so a lower heart rate have smaller lines, thinner lines. Higher is thicker and longer lines. Social is a network of triangles, and each triangle represents one person. And the self is represented as like the red triangle, and then each person surrounding them is a just black and white triangle. And sleep, from the recorded sleep states during the night, there is wake, light, REM, and deep, and this is represented as like a sequence of different symbols of each state. Sunlight is a timeline with color spectrum that represents how much daylight there is, so you can see from night, sunrise, day, sunset to night, and the amount of yellow would be how much full daylight there is during the day. And then weather are series of lines that are very flowy, and the calmer wind, it's not as flowy, and then the higher wind, it's way more chaotic and noisy. And then the weather, the temperature of the day would be the color of the background, and so this is just from a color spectrum mapped to the temperature of the day. And so finally, I'm going to show you how all of these patterns start to take shape and what they look together when they're all layered on top of each other. So for the month of July, I conducted my first test of my system and generated daily data drawings for the whole month of July. Some of my findings is that the process itself does create a very mindful and meditational like experience, especially because you're declaring your emotions. So it aided in a personal reflection, and it especially aided in being able to express my feelings to others. I had the actual words for emotions to be describing every day. And I also found that taking my thoughts and making them the title of 3 words for the day actually really allowed me to go through my day, my whole month at a glance to really have that 3 days to embody 3 words to embody each day to really see in a quick way what happened during the month. So as the month went on, freedom of drawing each pattern became way more apparent, and I think this process is specifically beneficial in an introspective setting in private due to the fact that other people encoding these organic and unconventional symbols is still a task with a very high cognitive load, and it kind of takes a while, so I still feel like it's best for your own self-viewing. So thank you for seeing my work in progress so far, and I will gladly take any questions after this. So thank you so much.
Hello. Thanks for coming to this session. We have Artist Talk Session 4. We had amazing presentations from the artists. My name is Jinsil, an associate professor in Texas A&M University in the States. I'd like to have our artists brief introduction of themselves. So maybe we can start with Jeff.
So, hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Morris. My video was first in this sequence. I'm an associate professor at Texas A&M University. It may sound familiar. And I'm trained as a composer and have branched out to bring in other disciplines, including electronics, creative coding, and visual arts into my work as well.
Thank you. Ulises? Maybe Ulises, please unmute yourself.
I'm so sorry. Hello, everybody. Congratulations about those amazing words. I am just finishing my PhD studies at Western University in art and visual culture. And during my PhD, I've been researching notions of listening and going deep in the theory of sound art. Just as a way of broadening my sustained project about the issue of cultural difference. And yeah, I am now trying to develop a little bit more these ideas in relation with the cultural problems related with my country, Ecuador, which is part of the Andean region. I will be happy to continue talking later.
Thank you. Abbey?
My name is Abbey Hepner, and I'm an assistant professor of photography at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. And most of my work deals with health, medical issues, and nuclear technology.
It's amazing. Alexa?
Hi, my name is Alexa. I am a lecturer at UC Davis, and my presentation was about my MFA thesis on using personal data to create daily data visualizations as daily drawings, like a journal. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I expected some questions from the audience, but currently we have 0 questions delivered yet. So any audience members listening to this session, please feel free to, ask questions on that swap card platform. Then I'll deliver those questions to the panel. Okay, maybe first, I'd like to ask a question just to start, talking about our works. I was curious always, like how individual artists, workflow or, kind of like a process, where you start, where you get some inspirations and where you get, some, how your seed idea actually become realized, right? So we have very different projects here, and it would be great to hear from you to kind of like go through your personal inspiration and the work process. Anyone wants to start?
I can start. So I actually have the impetus for this project was started a couple years back when I was found out about a process called meditational drawing, and I found it really relaxing as an alternative to journaling, because when it comes to journaling you have to find words, and as a kind of nonverbal person myself, I felt like finding patterns and visuals a lot more easier to like quote journal. So this all kind of started out as just real life like drawings by hand, and then as I started to work more with interactive media and creative coding, I figured out that you can actually create patterns like this with generative art. So I then started learning how to do that, and then once I learned a little bit more about using sensors and data to produce values, then I was like, wow, I can actually like do this drawing from real data about myself, and really use this as a way to journal. And I thought it was fun to do because journaling could be very subjective, but it could also be really validating when you see certain patterns in your data. Like, for instance, if you had a particularly hard day and then you go back and you do this drawing and you see that your heart rate was up, you can kind of see, oh, like, wow, yeah, this day was really particularly stressful, and you can see that in the data, and it kind of helps you with processing your information a little bit. So that month that I did that every single day, the ability to like process and also communicate to others also became easier, and it was very surprising that had like potential like that.
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else want to share your workflow or process?
Well, sure. I'm at a university, it's Jinsil, that is very technology oriented for concrete results, and so I've found myself constantly having to ask well, as artists, we all know when someone wants to find one word that describes what you do, so that they have that image, and then it'll be settled. And so professionally, that's been a perennial challenge here. What do you do? And well, then why do these things all sound so different? Are you a jazz person, or are you an electronic person, or what? And so that process has allowed me to hone my ability to reflect on my process. And so that's your question. And my process is to devise or derive a new process for each piece, something that most natively fits that situation. And so the one thing that's in common for each project is going in not so much with my own ideas, but just my own curiosity, and see, how can I make this situation, whatever it is, if it's a device or a data set or a physical place, how can I make it speak? How can I make it sing? How can I make something come out of it? And then, how can I explore the artistic interest with it, and then develop it, and then bring myself into it and engage it that way. So designing processes is the one thing that's constant across my process. So you could call it a meta process, I suppose, that unifies what I do.
Right, definitely. Yeah, I think I hear some, like a sound lags. I don't know if that's my connection problem or overall, but I'm sorry if I had any part, I missed. Yeah, definitely there is one unified, art practice, right? Especially, these days we try all different things together, sometimes combining and separating and then things, differently. But I kind of wanted to hear, what's the general, ideas, and also more personal stories if possible. Yeah, thank you for your perspective, Jeff. Maybe Abby?
Sure. Yeah, mine starts a kind of a strange place. My grandmother actually had endometriosis, and she died when she was 24. So I really don't know much about her story, but it was this little seed that then I became really interested in the entire history of endometriosis and pelvic pain disorders, and it took me back to the 1600s. And then I did a trip to Europe where I went to anatomical and operating theaters and really learned a lot about the history of women's medicine. And so there's sort of this like really small seed that got placed of personal interest. But I'm also really fascinated by places and architecture, and this idea that, like there's something that exists in these places viscerally that connect us to history. So that's sort of like where I started early on in the process. And I think coming to the decision to do VR in these spaces just came really naturally by going to them and thinking about like trying to translate that entire space.
That's great. Yeah, I'm also very interested in anatomy or like health related subjects as an artist, because there is a lot of things, artists actually contribute to the medical history and also medical even education. Hopefully we have some, other time to talk more about this, but, a lot of, medical schools actually inviting artists for their students to learn some artistic practices, especially drawing. So I think it has a lot of potential for us to actually collaborate with them too. It's great, thank you. And Ulises?
Yeah. Thank you. My notion of process or my inspiration, I think it's very related to how has been my education, my artistic education in Ecuador, where the education, I will say, is not so structured in terms of contemporary art, and this, let's say, open way of going on has determined that the artistic impulse has been very related to a social condition. I think a lot of process in my artistic trajectory has come from this reaction to the social relations, to the social context. And in the process of becoming involved in more theoretical issues about contemporary art, this process of, let's say, reaction to an understanding of how the contemporary art, or in general, the art culture in some way shape some social relations. That has been an important space for me to work, to play in some way. And because of that, precisely this interest in sound, in listening as a way of considering how people are becoming in relation, it's part of this presence in the field of contemporary art of very, very present ways of working. For example, in relation with collaborative art, in relation with all these social tendencies that artists are involved. And I consider that sound, the context of music, it's quite important too, to understand also these very, very important notions for the artistic work, and also for the issue of spectatorship, that I think it's very, very, very being redefined through the use of new media, to technology. And yeah, my work, the presentation of the project here, has to do with all these interests.
That's great. Yeah, when I was, viewing your video work, soundscape work, like I was like, oh, I'm in that space, right? Kind of like it makes me really relax, and it's even some kind of meditative state. I kind of felt. Always, like looking at those works, really like, oh, I want to make that kind of work too. Apparently I can't do that, but it's really I think those soundscape works, I think that those make people kind of like immediately become kind of like open and relaxed and flexible to the environment, kind of like make them kind of observe things. I think the work has that power. Okay. Do you guys have any ideas you want to like share or respond to one of our artists presented? Okay, I'm not getting any questions from outside of this platform. So okay, so let's see. Maybe I'd like to ask Jeff first. I'm more visual artist than a visual installation artist, I believe. And then, your work has a lot of performative component and also visual component as well. I was wondering, what are the roles of visuals and bodily performance component in your, musical interactive musical, performances. And also I was wondering, always, this kind of performance, we always have audience members, right, and participants. And I was wondering how you actually get, incorporate their feedback, or, in general, like how did they respond to your work? I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, maybe in reverse order. I often end up performing in basically classical music venues, or academic places that are following the classical music audiences weren't always old and quiet the whole time, but that's the expectation now. Not the old part, but the quiet part. And so for my stage performances, there is certainly some intuitive, less obvious mode of feeling the vibe in the air, so to say. But it's kind of a otherwise a most austere performance platform, where really I think that's probably why I focus more on performing with other live improvisers, and we're improvising together and have so much indeterminacy in the process. And maybe intuitively I've kind of gravitated toward that because of this austere quiet audience situation. So we're kind of generating enough intensity for the whole audience, hopefully, in those live performances. Otherwise, I do some installation work too, and like to have motion in the environment, or other factors, especially if I like to have those influence the artwork, especially in ways where there's a balance between the audience or the visitors knowing that they're controlling it, or how they're controlling it. I'm still pursuing a way of describing or defining that balance, but vending machines do exactly what, or they almost always do, or we get a new vending machine. They do exactly what you expect. You push a button and something happens, and no one wants to get to know a vending machine. They're not interesting. So I try to steer my work and my students' work away from things that are that put that plain cut and dried control in the hands of the audience. On the other hand, if the audience doesn't think that they have any influence in it, then they have no reason to get engaged with it. And so I try to find a balance there, but I'm able to design that in with installations. And you were asking about the movement and the visuals. Even though my work has evolved into visual media, I'm still careful to not present myself explicitly as a visual artist. I insist I'm still thinking about visuals as a composer. And so, we have sound art as opposed to music that sometimes gets associated with when visual artists or people who are primarily working as visual artists work as sound. So maybe this is, visual music means something else, but this is kind of a counterpart to that. So I'm still thinking in composerly ways, even when I'm dealing with other media. As far as the movement, it's I embrace the movement, but I try not to design the movement. I do like to find situations that require some sort of human scale movement, at a shoulder scale rather than knuckle scale. Me playing with a gamepad, I can get an awful lot done, but look like I'm doing nothing, and that can put a barrier between myself and the audience. So elbow scale, shoulder scale, or that end of the human scale kinds of motion, or ones that I don't usually purposefully design in, but I welcome them when there's opportunities. And so then it ends up making me move, but it's all driven by the piece. So with the visuals, I'm still a composer. With the movements, I'm still I'm letting the piece kind of control me, or at least my desires to affect musical changes force my body to move in certain ways.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm not a performance artist. So I don't like, I always say like I cannot dance, but always, you know, like performance artists kind of like explore and then kind of like, you know, fly through the music or fly through the piece itself, kind of like it let them, you know, like kind of like fly with the music, right? So I always admire performance artists, you know, kind of improv all those and understanding those situations and then making decision about their emotion. I think it's really great. Finally, we have a question from the audience to everybody. How much do you develop your work by yourself and how much is from the collaboration? So maybe you want to talk about, you know, your collaboration experience, you know, also maybe collaboration process. Also, you can introduce, you know, interesting collaboration, maybe, you know, like within the current project, also maybe some other projects as well. Alexa, you want to start?
Sure. So I'd say that my experience is definitely mostly individual work, with with certain experiences attached to it, like critique with my other cohort in my MFA program. So, I mean, being able to share my work every single week definitely is a collaborative experience. I think the most helpful experience was being able to meet very often with the DataViz lab on campus. So being able to share what I'm doing and also work collaboratively with them on their projects as a little bit more within the design space, along with other computer scientists. So that kind of influenced my work when I was working on my thesis alone. But it would have been nice to have a little bit more collaboration on developing code for this, because I think due to COVID and everything, that kind of fell through based on everybody's like availability and stuff. So could have been a little bit more developed that way, but most of the actual work itself is individual.
Great. I was thinking maybe since, you know, you already developed your artwork based on, you know, collecting data of yourself and then visualizing in, you know, in a really poetic way, dealing with emotion. I think that practice can be actually introduced to other artists or other scientists. Maybe you guys can actually collaborate and then develop a different set of data, and then that could be exhibited as well. I think that would be beautiful.
Yeah, I really agree with that, especially because looking in the future with this work of what could be beneficial to certain communities, especially in like mental health spaces. So being able to collaborate with people in psychology would be a really great way forward with this.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, maybe Abby, you want to share your experience in terms of collaboration?
Sure. Well, I think a number of my other projects are collaborative, but this project I would say mostly was done personally. Although all of the places that I went to, I was learning from a lot of people kind of on the ground, like for example in Padua. And some of the things that I talk about in the space, and even some of the audio sounds that happen in like the VR app, come directly from people that work in those places and kind of give more context and a little bit more history. But for me, that was sort of the main point of collaboration, was just working with people on the ground and having their kind of input and information.
Do you think this can be expanded to other forms of collaboration? For example, working with, you know, like medical school people or people from industry, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's something to think about in the future. I mean, especially in thinking about MRI and that kind of work. I have an entire other project that I've done with a neuropsychologist who researches brains. And so, you know, I just haven't gotten there in this project, but definitely like that's a great space to think of for the future.
Yeah, I think your project should be included part of the, history of women health or something like that. I think that would be great, for even medical students, kind of learn about those history. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Ulises, you want to share your experience?
Yes, thank you. I think the collaboration issue is a central part in my artistic reflection now, and I think it has a relation with issues of race. I think that is an important concern, especially in my context, where usually the collaborative art it's always in relation with subaltern groups. So I try to be very reflexive about working with people that belongs to other culture, a subaltern culture. I think that is an important part in my work, and I try to resolve in more practical terms this concern about collaboration of what is doing one person or another. I think that is not the central problem. I think what is important in these cases a more broad understanding of the cultural relations and the use of some concepts. For example, in this case, I am working with a musician, which is clearly part of a rural context. So I try to build this relation in a very, let's say, dialogical way, creating some spaces of understanding. And I think in that process, there is not so much important what is doing what person. I think that the question has to do with a more reflexive approach about some historical process of how this social position has been built. So I think that is how I am approaching this issue of collaboration. No?
Yeah, you had a few collaborators, I guess. Sorry, I don't remember correctly then. I think a videographer or maybe sound person. What was the relationship you had with them?
Yeah, I think this person the main collaboration is with a musician with his name is Jose Sango Kisa. But I would say that in my context where we don't have a support, we don't have sponsors for making productions, even if this is a not so complicated production, but we are not accustomed to have a budget, we will say, to produce an artistic work. It is more, we understand this more as a kind of help of friends that it's just some kind of support as a friend, but it's not part of in itself of the work.
I see. Okay, thank you so much. Jeff, would you share your experience?
Sure. Well, the most visible collaborations in my presentation today were my improvisations with other humans on stage, and those they are very intense collaboration, but in maybe kind of a different way that doesn't seem so collaborative in the traditional sense, because for the most part I work with other improvisers who are just very brave musicians, and so often we go on without even a rehearsal, maybe not even without a sound check, and they're used to saying, "Okay, Jeff, what's the game? What's going to happen this time?" And what have I built? And I'll give them. This is often on stage, and so I don't have time to give them the whole rundown, and I don't want to give the whole rundown, but I give them some idea of what to expect and how to behave, and then we get into it. And so I have certain collaborations where we've spent more time making music together than conversing, than talking. So even though I have some collaborations that have only happened on stage, they've been very intense ones, and it's a different way to get to know a person in certain ways. Earlier in my career, I have had more traditional collaborations with dance and with a theater program at my university, and so I found myself already in this state of wanting to find a way to play the situation. And so people from different disciplines were talking, and I delight in when we discover that different people in different disciplines use the same words to describe different things. And so this dance of vocabulary I found it to be enlightening, to realize that different disciplines value different things. They approach things in different ways, and they even teach them in different ways. For example, in a music degree, music theory comes first, and you have 2 years of it, and then history. And in other artistic disciplines, theory is a thing just only for graduate students. You get in and do it first. And so that's always been a fruitful discovery. But in these collaborative meetings, I spend my time listening and watching what they do, what kinds of things they can do, what they're thinking of doing for this project. And I'm asking myself, how can I get something, how can I take something from that I can use? If they're moving in a certain way or they're using certain materials, is there a sound sound material that I can extract from that? Is there a movement that I could use to drive a process, or maybe just extract certain points from that and get visual movement from it? Is there some sort of data coming from it? And so I'm trying to see what can I extract from what people are already doing naturally for free, without trying to accommodate me. And then I spend an awful lot of my time building proofs of concept to explain to them what I want to do and how we go forward. Even in work that I've been doing more recently that is looks more like solo work, I still consider it very collaborative, because I'm perfectly happy with the ideas that I have on my own, but I'm even more thrilled with the ideas that I discover emerging in these situations as I can make them happen. So I often consider myself in a collaborative relationship, even though I'm the only sentient being around.
Yeah, that's great. Jeff, you brought many important aspects of collaboration, and whenever I also do collaboration, I spend a lot of time to actually to develop, nice, trustworthy relationship with the collaborators first, and then, to understand what they're saying, and then like learning about their area first. And then, once we develop the trust, actually we can nicely, naturally work together and then develop ideas or something like that. So I think that, collaboration would be great to have just, meetings and immediately we collaborate, but it doesn't really work that way. So I guess Ulises also mentioned, like a relationship, like a naturally emerged collaborative, relationship. I think that's really important. We have to invest some time for that as well. Thank you. We have a question for Abbey from the audience. What have you learned about the VR platform during your project it's perfect to immersion of the unique architecture?
That's a good question. And sometimes in my project, even though like my initial first way that I designed it was actually for use like in a gallery and in a little bit more complex of a setting, over time I kind of dumbed it down to be accessible just on a cell phone with Google Cardboard. And like a lot of that is accessibility and also just preferring kind of a simplified version of it. But in terms of VR, I don't know, that's a really good question. I guess I haven't thought that much about, like, I certainly learned how to use the platforms and I learned a lot about how other artists are using it. I think a big thing that becomes a part of my work is a lot of questions about ethics in VR. And like even things like deciding to film the spaces from the viewpoint of the audience rather than the viewpoint, for most part, like flat on the table. And that has a little bit to do with kind of ethics and questioning like audience and participant, and even I might go as far to say victim. And so I think that was like a big exploration for me, was just learning a ton about like the platforms, how to use them, things that I didn't like and I wanted to simplify, and then also like ethical questions in VR.
That's great. I was also wondering, 360 videos, I mean, depending on the platform, like Google Cardboard or, high-end head-mounted display, also depending on the quality of the camera, you actually capture the, 360 video, right? Did you consider, like utilizing your video on, like a higher-end, head-mounted display? Or I also was wondering, like, what kind of camera did you use for capturing 360 images?
The camera that I used actually was a GoPro.
Oh, okay.
A GoPro that has like 360. It has like a camera on each side. And the initial way that I showed the work was through basically just like a head-mounted platform and sensors in the space.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like a much more complex way of showing it. But that's how it started. And then from there, I kind of wanted it to shrink down to a little bit more accessible platform. And also, like in the gallery setting, it presented a lot of issues when people were using it too, because of the fact that they're like rotating their body around. I had to make sure that there was a chair or something that they could stabilize themselves, which is also like a big part of what I'm interested in as somebody who has a lot of vestibular issues. Like, it's kind of funny that I basically design artworks that make me really sick. Yeah, but all of those like first platforms, I sort of like went for a little bit higher end, and then over time.
Oh, I see. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, hopefully we answer to Nicholas. Maybe I'd like to, I have like lots of more questions, but maybe do you guys have any questions like each other? Do you want to ask questions to other artists? If you have any questions.
I've certainly enjoyed seeing everyone's work. I'm still testing it since we just got to see the videos.
Yeah, that was great. Maybe, while you're thinking about some questions, I'll ask more questions then. To Alexa, I really enjoyed your final visualization, and also I really enjoyed your kind of legend, those keys for each component, all those design components as well. I was wondering, how did you connect all those little visual icons for emotions? Each one has different shapes and different color combinations and everything, right? And I was wondering how you actually connect, I kind of wanted to see, how you actually made it, what does that mean? I mean, you explained, the different colors, but I would like to hear more about the kind of rationale to create those emotional icons.
Sure. So I wanted to create somewhat of a visual language amongst all of the emotional categories. So even though like a lot of them are different, they still take on similar shapes based on their discrete emotion. So there's like 10 emotions that are kind of subcategories of happiness or sadness and so on. So all of those in the same categories will still have the same general shape. As far as what the individual design inside of that shape was honestly really intuitive on my part. I didn't really do any more research further than creating just like the kind of visual language of them all having a a common shape to them, but everything that was inside of it was just like purely artistic decision on my part based on my interpretation of that certain kind of emotion.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah.
Definitely, maybe, you can document that somehow, that would be a great research as well, like how you interpret your emotional connection to certain emotion, and how to present that, demonstrate that as a, some visual language, visual form. I think that would be great. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any questions for each other still?
Oh, I have a question for Jeff. You used, so what in particular was the generative, I guess, what was producing that sound? Like, was it recordings from other things, or was it like synthesizers, or like what was the actual sound that was coming out based on what it was sensing?
In mine, I presented a number of different pieces. So which sound did you have in mind?
Kind of just in general, like what would you usually use?
Let's see. For some of them, it was just feedback loops, either acoustic digital feedback loops. So it was something that emerges from the acoustics in the space, or just in the when I was playing the mixer, I was taking the output of the mixer and plugging it into its own input, and that was the only source. And so I kind of describe it like when a pearl grows in an oyster, a little bit of sand gets in this case, it's a little bit of noise in the circuitry, and then it just grows naturally from there. In other times, like with the piece that was inspired by the building with the Airstream trailer on top of it, I was synthesizing some of those sounds, but was trying to, at the core, not make them from scratch, but still drive them by source recordings from the environment. So sounds of trains going by, and then I would just heavily filter it so that it might be this very melodic, ringing celesta kind of instrument that whose pitch was driven by video of the skyline as it was passing, or there's a drum set in that as well. And I was pleased to see one of my drummer collaborators ask me who was playing drums on that, and I'm still not sure he understands. But the drum set was carved from all the drum sounds were carved from that noisy train situation. So I took what was there and carved out the parts that wouldn't sound like that wouldn't contribute to something like a snare drum or a cymbal in a drum set. But I was trying to either let sounds emerge naturally, or capture sounds and then carve them into something new. So even if you can't tell that, it's definitely different from the soundscape projects we've seen, but there's still some sort of fingerprint or some DNA of that natural situation that's there, and hopefully that lends some degree of coherence and connection with the piece. So I like to use a lot of different approaches, but all with in mind to find ways to honor the situation itself and give voice to it, let it sing as much as I can let it sing on its own.
That's great.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah. Any other questions do you have?
I had a question for Alexa. I know you touched a little bit on like potential therapeutic practices for your design, and I might have missed it in your presentation, but I'm wondering what format would that take, like, or if you're even planning on doing something like that, or if that's potential in the future. Like, would it be something that people could navigate digitally?
Yeah, I definitely thought about creating it more aligned with like an application-based, like screen-based application that you can use. But I'd say it'd be something that you'd keep personally like a journal and be able to use it, not specifically to always like share and like give out like a social media platform or anything. I feel like it's kind of a personal experience. But as far as what I see potential uses for, definitely for those people who need to be, who do fall under categories of being nonverbal, or, you know, like people might have it be nonverbal if they have like dementia or autism, and other, or it could be also a very like grounding experience for those with people with like anxiety. Maybe if you experience like forms of dissociation or psychosis or something, being able to see all of the all of the attributes to your data like all present in this way that's like less analytical of like conventional graphs and data points that like really stem like more anxiety and overanalyzation, but instead it's like creating a more like a growing almost like integration method of using your data to then integrate into something else that's like a lot more of a positive view, even if it's negative data. So if even it's like something that's negative regarding like your emotion or other, your sleep was really bad or something, it still like is a presentation that you could be acceptable like to you. So that is like a very grounding experience for those who like become very ungrounded in their own self.
That's really great. I think like there's certainly potential too for people who deal with like pain management, right? Like a lot of time you're looking back and you see like, oh, these days I logged migraines or something. And sometimes, you know, when you live with that daily, you don't recognize like how much it affects the rest of your life. So that's really cool. I just think there's so much potential there.
Thank you.
Great. We have about like 3 minutes. Maybe for last minute, you know, can we share like briefly about your future direction you are taking, especially in this pandemic situation? Maybe Ulises, can you start? Ulises, we don't hear you.
Sorry. Well, here I have to tell again about my country where I am now, and here the situation is quite hard to see what will happen next. But in my case, I am just trying to continues working with reflection about listening, sound, and relations, and I think there are a lot of things to do working with this in this field in relations with creating new kinds of relations with groups, with people. I think that is it's a political responsibility now. I think the possibility of creating, of the potential that has the art for creating this approximation with people from different contexts, I think is a very, very important issue now.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes, maybe briefly. Want to share your future direction? Sorry. Oh, Alexa, go ahead.
Well, right now I am just starting to lecture, so being able to teach is really helpful to stay connected to the university, and so hopefully I can, I've been kind of taking a break from this project for a couple of weeks just to rest, but hopefully be able to start continuing working with the DataViz lab and collaborating with them when I meet with them, and maybe find other people that would continue kind of the future ideas that I had with this project.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Chad?
Officially, I'm still working on machine learning issues and finding ways to use it wrong in interesting ways. But I'm still, also just remaining open to following my curiosity as other things come in my way, and thankfully they have too. So I'm still moving along in both of those ways.
Okay, thank you. Abby?
I'm teaching this semester and also publishing a book, which is a little bit crazy in a pandemic, but there you have it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, artists. I mean, this was a great session. I see a lot of, relationship here as well. So hopefully, we can do some kind of collaboration or further discussion from this as well. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you so much for audience to listening us as well. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.